Two speakers left, we're running out of time.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you very much. And we're back now on the government side. And Deputy Durkan, I understand you've agreed to share time with Deputy Barry, if that's agreeable to Deputy Barry as well. So I give you 5 minutes each, if that's.
Thank you. And like other speakers, one has to empathise and sympathise with our neighbours in France and Paris on Friday evening, given the atrocity that was perpetrated against them. And one can only imagine the scenes of chaos and confusion, the loud explosions, the staccato bursts of automatic weapons, the sound and the smell of gunfire, and the smell of blood and terror. I think that's something that we all should recognise as something that prevails in a situation such as that and doesn't go away. It could happen to anybody, anywhere in the world at the present time. And I know that some speakers have different attitudes to what has happened and how it should be dealt with. I frankly don't know. But I am certain of one thing, that slowly, inexorably, we are moving in a direction that I am not happy about. And I don't know that anything can be done to stop that, because it would appear that we're heading towards confrontation, a major confrontation of international, previously not known since the Second World War. I think if that happens, it will be a disaster. I think there are ample opportunities at this stage for the people who are the perpetrators now here to think about it very carefully, because where the world is heading is not a place the world will want to go. And I wonder whether there's any sense in blaming ourselves at this stage, because we all know that the United States went into Iraq. It wasn't a good idea. Now, having said that, the president of Iraq at the time was not exactly a gentleman in the true sense of the word. He didn't treat his neighbours, his friends, or his enemies in a way that would be in accord with the Queensberry rules. The United States went in, as did Britain as well, into Afghanistan, and people condemned that. And I just want to remind myself and ourselves at this stage that the regime there weren't very affable either. They had a rather arbitrary attitude to almost everybody. They had an appalling attitude to minorities, to women, and to society around them. And they set about doing that. Over the last couple of years, there have been numerous attacks where aircraft have been down from the skies. There have been numerous attacks of terrorism all over the world, which have already been referred to by my colleagues. And in those circumstances, there are messages. And the messages are, we are coming at you. We're coming for you. That's the message. Whether we like it or not, that is the message. And I feel that there's very little, perhaps, that we can do, because anything that is based on hatred, and there appears to be a great deal of hatred. My grounds for thinking along those lines is simply this. Over the last couple of years, we've seen countless instances where people have been beheaded, where there have been appalling atrocities committed in front of television cameras, the purpose of which is to terrorise the people at whom it is directed. So whether they be in a country in the east or in the west is immaterial. And I want to simply make a comparison with other times and other eras in the early part of the 20th century. When somebody else started on that route, on that road, in the same way, there were grievances at the time. There were people who could point out to the grievances and say somebody should do something about it, and that that society was being penalised unnecessarily, and that people should address it. They did. With what appalling consequences? 70 million people died in the course of that. And I think that if we learn one thing from that appalling war, it should be that we should never try to allow it to happen again. So then we have to address the issue is with whom are we dealing? Are we dealing with people who have revenge, that they wish to pursue revenge for past atrocities? Then we're going to go a long way back. We go back 3,000 or 4,000 years, because one violent attack begets another, and begets another. We've seen that in this country. We've seen it all over the world. Where does it stop? So I would say that I'm going to finish with this because I have to. Daniel O'Connell was in France during the revolution, and he came to the conclusion that to pursue a political objective was not worth the cost of a single life, and he was opposed to violence to achieve a political objective all his life. And I could go on, and I'm sure everybody else could as well. I have to say this: I am concerned. Okay, here, look, that we may find ourselves sliding into something the result of which nobody can ever tell. And there's no sense blaming ourselves for this. We may be called. We may be called. We may have to face the reality in this country as well. We may have to activate our defences in whichever way we can. This is coming towards us, make no doubt about that, and all that can be done is to alleviate it as best we can. I'm sorry, I couldn't.
No, you're fine. Thank you very much, Deputy Barry.
Thank you, Cathaoirleach. I'm very grateful to get the opportunity to speak on this topic, and certainly I would like to offer and extend my sympathy towards all those people who obviously were killed, injured and affected by what happened last Friday night. It is quite astounding. I don't think any words could describe it. However, it has certainly opened a new vista to the Europe and the world that we are living in. We have to stand by our French brothers and sisters and our fellow human beings and say this is just an absolute travesty that if we can at all, we need to see can we prevent it happening again. It's a challenge, and it's a challenge to life as we know it. We thankfully have had a relatively peaceful existence in Europe for quite a while, but we can't forget that war ravaged Europe for many decades. I remember when I visited Lithuania a few years ago, 10 years ago now, they had 5 different administrations in the previous 100 years with devastating consequences for the normal people. And they had that still percolated down through their beings, and it upset an awful lot of people, but they moved on from it. But we certainly don't want to return to that. Obviously, the vast majority of Muslims and other religions are peaceful people. And, you know, we have to try and tackle this problem because we cannot allow the mindset out there to brand everybody the same, much as, unfortunately, the Irish were branded or mistrusted in England for many years because of other reasons. You know, we need to make sure that we try and identify with those people who want peace, and we try and work with them to try and tackle this developing problem. I don't think we should forget either that the world population is absolutely spiralling. And the world population, it took, decades upon decades to increase by 1 billion. But once we hit the 19th century, we were moving up 1 billion in a matter of short few years. So because of better healthcare, better food, you know, the world in the last 3 years has produced the largest harvests it has ever produced since it came into existence. So we are producing vast quantities of food, but we have vast populations. But unfortunately, they're not being equally distributed, and there are competition for this. Democracy is at the centre of all this. You know, we might disagree with each other over economic decisions. We might reject philosophies by other people. But I think in all this, and no matter how difficult the arguments are, there needs to be a respect for democracy, and that sometimes that is forgotten. It is so hard won, and the majority of the places that we are discussing where problems are attributed from do not have a functioning democracy. Whatever the failings in democracies are, I think it's something that we need to recognise. I had an intern and was very privileged to have an intern with us a few years ago whose father sailed in a canoe or some type of single-person boat across the sea to Italy. He worked, got his family across, risked life and death, and she now is an amazing person who will reach the top echelons, I hope, in law or whatever she's studying in that area. So not all people who come to Europe, and that brings me to the refugee issue. A lot of people who come to Europe desperate to escape from terrible conditions. An awful lot of those people have huge potential to offer us as a community, and we need to try and put a system in place that will welcome the people who will contribute to our society and make us more multicultural and give us a true perspective of what a multicultural society can add to us. In conclusion, it will take a lot of like-minded people from various European nations and otherwise to engage constructively if we are to get a multi-pronged approach to this. And this means understanding the people who do terrible acts like this. We need to understand how they do it. First of all, we need to try and counteract it immediately, but we need the long-term view of how we can educate these people against doing what is something against human nature entirely. Possibly European defence will have to be discussed at some point. I heard people in the devastation after Paris saying, you know, we need political leadership. Absolutely. And it is great to hear people saying we need political leadership. Now is the time for the European leaders to stand up to this. And you know what? That will bring us the answers, hopefully, in time.
Thanks,
and I
Deputy.
suppose to those people who lost their lives, I would just like to say, may they rest in peace.
Thank you very much, Deputy. The next slot is the technical group, Deputy Boyd Barrett, Deputy McGrath and Deputy Daly. And you've 10 minutes between you, and I have to call on the Minister at 7:20, so just over three.
Three. Minister, the attack by ISIL in Paris was a vile and barbaric atrocity, which must be condemned unreservedly, and indeed we must do everything to defeat the sort of poisonous, inhuman ideology that drove such an attack. I think that should be clear to all of us. But for precisely that reason, I would appeal to this government to raise its voice against the moves and actions now by the French government and the US government and the Russians to respond to this atrocity and the situation in Syria by compounding it further by bombing people in cities like Raqqa and elsewhere in Syria. To do that is to pour petrol on an already disastrous fire and to ensure that that fire spreads. For them to continue to bomb or to bomb as a response to this will not prevent atrocities like the ones we saw on Friday in Paris. It will ensure that we have more of them. We must avoid that. If our concern and our shock means anything, we must act to prevent atrocities like that happening. And we must recognise that US, Russian, American bombing has, for example, claimed 457 innocent lives, Syrian lives, over the last year. Every single one of those deaths, 100 of those were children, are just as tragic, just as barbaric, just as inhumane, and must be condemned just as equally. To kill more innocent people as a response to Paris will be a disaster. And of course, this was the point that the anti-war movement made after the atrocities of 9/11 in New York. We warned when hundreds of thousands, millions went on the streets, and we urged and begged countries like the United States and Britain not to compound that tragedy by going and bombing countries like Afghanistan and Iraq, because it would make the situation worse, it would spread the instability, and it would guarantee more people being pushed into the hands of vile jihadist, extremist groups and so on. And of course, that's exactly what happened. If we are going to deal with this problem, don't pour the petrol on the fire that makes it worse, and deal with the inconsistencies and hypocrisies of Western and big power policy in supporting brutal and despotic regimes in Israel, in Saudi Arabia, in Syria itself, in Iraq, in Egypt, and stop giving finance and arms and political support to these regimes that create the conditions which give rise to extremist groups like ISIL and the chaos we're seeing in Syria.
Deputy McGrath.
First of all, let me offer my deepest sympathy and sincerest sympathy to all of the families of the Paris atrocity last Friday night. The horrific attack on completely innocent people was a bad day for humanity, and no words from me tonight will bring back those people, and their families will grieve for a long time. One could not be moved this morning on RT Radio when I heard Katie Healy from County Louth, who was attending the rock concert with her boyfriend David Nolan from County Cork, where 89 people were killed, and yet they managed to escape while David was shot in the leg. The fear, the violence, the intimidation and the whole nightmare for these young people really shocked many of us. It will live with them for years, but they did escape, and for me all human life is precious, and I wish them and their families well. Their families will be glad to have them back. So in the Dáil today, all TDs are united in our grief for all of the people killed and injured. It's also important that these victims get all of our support and all of our solidarity. It's equally important to express our support and solidarity and sympathy to all of the other victims in the recent attack on the Russian civilian aircraft, with 222 people killed, 45 people killed in Lebanon, and the October the 10th massacre in Turkey, where 102 Turks, most of them secular leftists and Kurds. And then we have the nightmare for the Palestinian people, for the Iraqi people, and for the ordinary men and women of Syria. These are the people. All lives matter for me, and there must never be a hierarchy of victims, as some would try to do. It's also important not to label the Muslim population, or attack people, or blame migrants, or attack anti-war voices that are genuinely opposed to all violence. It's important to react in a calm and sensible manner. And Ireland can lead on this from our own experience, from our own history, and our own vision of peacekeeping. Only last Wednesday, I met some of the families of the Dublin and Monaghan bombings, and the pain and the hurt is still there, and they still look for truth and justice. So let's all unite and support all the victims and all their families. Finally, if we are really serious about ending these atrocities, we need to support a United Nations approach that will protect the innocent and implement an international policing policy impartially and fairly. It's got to be fair, balanced, but also very decisive. Some Western powers have to face the reality that their actions and their history has, to put it mildly, not helped the situation.
Deputy, I have
Shooting
to stop you there.
or bombing people in pubs or at concerts or families in their beds is never, ever an option, regardless of any political or religious disagreements. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy. And Deputy Daly, a tight 4 minutes, Deputy.
Thanks, Chair. I too would like to put on record my solidarity with the French people for the appalling slaughter that occurred on the streets of Paris on Friday night, at a time which should have been the most happiest and relaxing of times for innocent citizens who had nothing got to do with the conflict that led to their deaths. I've listened today and in the media to points of sympathy and solidarity from all sides of the House, and I believe those expressions to be well-meaning and to be utterly sincere. But you know what? I have to say as well that it's just not good enough. And the people of France and the people of Beirut and the people of Iraq and the people of Yemen deserve more than kind words. We need to get to grips and get to solutions about what is going on in this world. Now, on Friday night, Deputy Wallace tweeted his horror at what was happening in France, but also connecting it to French military action, one of the biggest superpowers on the world. And we got condemned for asking why. On no time, neither now nor then, would we ever justify the barbaric, monstrous conduct of ISIS. But we have a right to ask why, and we do ask why on a regular basis. And the reason for that is that everybody knows that ISIS exists in the areas that were subjected to Western bombardment. Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Yemen. These are the places where ISIS lives. Everybody knows it is the Saudi, Gulf princes, the UAE and Qatar who are funding these monsters. And yet Minister Bruton had no problem in here last week when Deputy Wallace questioned him in our country doing business with the Saudis, giving them money which undoubtedly will be used to fund or arm ISIS. Can you not see the hypocrisy in that? Can you not see the hypocrisy in the fact that Shannon Airport, probably today, was used to transit munitions or troops to the Middle East? That last year 2 flights overflew with munitions and explosives to Saudi Arabia. How do we know that they didn't end up in the hands of ISIS? We do know that weaponry belonging to the West in Iraq ended up in the hands of ISIS. So why not some of the weaponry that transited over Ireland to Afghanistan? How do we know that that didn't? We don't, because we don't search and we don't ask, but we do allow ourselves to be willing allies of that process. So when the Taoiseach gets up and responds earlier and says that our response has to be increased security, increased vigilance, but doesn't open his mouth about our complicity in the horror that's unfolding, I actually think that that's not good enough. I don't think it's good enough for the families who are grieving in France. I don't think it's good enough for Irish citizens who are rightly worried about what is going on in this world. People are struggling to make sense of the nightmare because it doesn't make sense. Because if you look at the papers and the stock exchange, there are winners out of this. America, on the one hand, condemns what's going on and signs off a multi-billion contract with the Saudis for arms. The US defence firms' share prices are skyrocketing today, and the defence industry in Britain is getting an extra $2 billion for its coffers. Money is dictating. We need to do things differently if we're going to get a solution, and Ireland has a pivotal role, could have, in this as a country if we were truly neutral with our peacekeeping history, and I really think that it's about time we started playing our role on the world stage in that way.
Thank you, Deputy. And I call on the Minister now to respond to the debate. Minister Deenihan.
Thank you. Okay, look, I've listened carefully to the contributions made here today, and it is abundantly clear that this House stands foursquare with the French people at this moment of national crisis. We are united in offering our solidarity and our sympathy at this difficult time. Like so many others, I was appalled, shocked and saddened when I heard about the terrorist attacks in Paris on Friday evening, that the lives of 129 innocent people were so callously ended in these acts of terror beggars belief. My thoughts and prayers are first and foremost with the families and loved ones of those who died. I want to remember too the hundreds of people who were injured, many very seriously, who will carry the legacy of this attack for the rest of their lives. They are in all our thoughts, and as they embark on the long road to recovery. Ireland and France enjoy ties of friendship that goes back hundreds of years. We are a sociable people and share a love of conversation, food and, of course, sport. Thousands of French people have made Ireland their home and vice versa. We stand with you like family at this very difficult time. Like many others, I was struck at the random nature of Friday's attack. This was an act of savagery perpetrated against humanity, against free societies, against life itself. It was perpetrated by people who have shown by their actions over many years that they attach little or no value to human life, or indeed to artistic or cultural achievement. Young or old, Christian or Muslim, charity worker or journalist, none have been considered worthy of their compassion or understanding. Following news of the Paris attacks, officials in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade were instructed to activate the Department's Emergency Consular Response Centre to provide assistance and advice to Irish citizens and concerned families. Experienced consular officials in Paris and Dublin worked through the night on Friday to provide assistance, and the Department's Consular Response Centre remained in operation until lunchtime on Sunday. Both the Embassy team and the Consular Division of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade here in Dublin remain ready to assist any citizens in need or concern for loved ones. Anyone with concerns should contact the Consular Division of my department. One Irish citizen was seriously injured by the gunfire in the Bataclan theatre incident, but thankfully is making a recovery following surgery. Embassy Paris and officials in headquarters here in Dublin are in close contact with the citizen and his family and with the French authorities, and have been providing extensive consular assistance. Paris remains in a state of emergency, and Irish citizens there should exercise caution and follow the instructions of the local authorities. While airports and borders remain open, anyone travelling within, to or from France should expect additional security measures and possible travel disruptions. It is extremely important at times like this that entire communities are not stigmatised because of the actions of a few. The vast majority of people in our minority communities are entirely peace-loving, and the appalling actions of a small number of extremists in Paris do not reflect the views of the Muslim community in this country or in other states. There was a meeting of the Foreign Affairs Council yesterday where there was a determination shown by all member states to stand in solidarity with France and to work together to do all we can to protect our citizens. EU Justice Ministers will meet on Friday to consider what further measures should be considered at European level. The war in Syria or instability in the Middle East is no justification for these evil acts of terrorism, whether in Paris, Beirut or Istanbul. Clearly, these attacks will require a rapid and effective response at the European and national level. Here in Ireland, we are keeping our national security under close review. Were acts of this horrendous nature to go unpunished or to be accepted as the new normal, clearly many of the values that we cherish, including the right to express one's belief, the right to travel, the right to enjoy the company of our family and friends in peace and without fear, would be under threat. This is then a time to be vigilant, a time to increase our efforts to combat terrorism, a time to stand in solidarity with our EU partners in combating this menace to our common security. This is, of course, also a time to be clear that our response to acts or threats of terror should never be at the expense of the very values we espouse, rule of law, human rights and respect for diversity, which are at the heart of our European identity. In conclusion, I would like to once again to convey my sympathy and that of this House to all those whose lives have been irrevocably changed by Friday's terrible tragedy, and to send a message of support and solidarity to France and the French people from the people of Ireland. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Well, that concludes the statements on the terrorist attack in Paris. And it's just coming up to 7:30 now, so we'll be moving now to the next business, and the next business, in fact, private members' business, and a motion on housing. And I understand, I have a number of names offering, but I understand it's in your name, Deputy Coppinger. Are you the sole speaker? And Deputy who?
We've 10 minutes each.
So you've 3 speakers?
No, 10 minutes each now, and then there's other speakers.
There may be others. Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'll call on you then, Deputy Coppinger, to...
Okay. Is the Minister dealing with coming in for this?
Well, we wait till 7:30, if that's all right.
Yeah.
Are you taking this? understand, Deputy, the Minister is deputising for Deputy Kelly. So if you'd like to start now. For half an hour? Yeah. Will you be done? Yeah, grand. So for half an hour, so if you'd like to start.
Okay. Well, I would just like to register that that's very disappointing that the Minister himself wouldn't come in for private members' business. Because, yeah, but I mean, I'm proposing, and Deputy Murphy as well, and he'll miss our whole contribution. That's extremely disappointing. It's not taking it very seriously, private members' business, and there's one person sitting there from the government. I'd like to propose the motion on behalf of the Anti-Austerity Alliance. Obviously, I'd like to reject the amendment as well put by the government. We chose this topic tonight in recognition of the fact that there is no more serious and pressing issue in this country than the housing situation. We don't get much private members' time, probably 2 or 3 a year, and we felt the housing situation was so much more pressing than anything else. Now, unfortunately, the Minister responsible for housing obviously is absent, but also has treated this issue with hyperbole and bluster beyond belief. Just to give you a couple of quick quotes. Last year, the Minister said absolutely everything that can be done, will be done, and is being done in relation to the housing crisis. He said we're going to clear waiting lists for social housing by 2020, a hugely ambitious claim under any circumstances. The social housing lists were never cleared at any time before. But he also then, in October last year, said the largest housing programme probably in the history of the state, end quote, was being undertaken by this government. Now, unfortunately for the people who are suffering the misery of the housing crisis and the rents crisis, the Minister responsible, if he actually built as many houses as he announced, we wouldn't be in this predicament, because never was so much promised and so little actually delivered. The first thing that the Anti-Austerity Alliance calls for in the motion is a declaration by this Dáil and by you that this is a national housing emergency, because only then will all resources that are necessary to be used to resolve this actually be deployed, including passing any laws necessary to end any obstacles in the way of home building of an affordable and social nature. Because, Minister, we have to recognise nothing the government is doing is working. And we have to approach this like previous governments approached, for example, the TB crisis. TB was a scourge in this country, killed many people, but it was eliminated with a determined campaign, obviously by Minister Noel Brown and that government. Even the BSE crisis got more attention, it would seem, than this human emergency. Now, the fact that nothing is working is evidenced by 2 things that happened today. An increase in homelessness since last month alone. In Dublin, which is the epicentre of the tsunami that Peter McVerry spoke about, 40 more families and 82 more children are now in hotels, sofa surfing, or in precarious accommodation and are homeless. People are now not even guaranteed a hotel place. All of the people who come to us on a regular basis, now they're forced to self-accommodate, which means that they often end up with no accommodation whatsoever. And in fact, one homeless family I've been dealing with is in Kildare tonight, even though they're from Blanchardstown. So in the motion, for example, we call for an emergency measure to be taken. NAMA owns 1/8 of all the hotel rooms in this country. A sufficient number of hotel places could and should be refurbished to allow families to cook, have other facilities that they need as an emergency measure while houses are being built. But of course, the other embarrassing episode for the government today was the daft.ie survey. You've broken another record, because now rents have risen more than they've risen since you came to power. Daft.ie showed that rents have jumped 3.2% in the 3-month period, July to September. It's the largest 3-month increase since 2007, so since the recession kicked in. People are now nationally paying €82 more a month in rent than they did last year. But in Dublin, it's much higher. In Dublin West, my own constituency, rents have gone up €241 a month in the last 2 years. So somebody is paying now €241 more than they paid 2 years ago, and obviously their income hasn't increased in a commensurate fashion. So the minister huffed and puffed about rent controls and came back empty-handed from his spat with Fine Gael. Now, contrary to your government amendment, this isn't really that complex at all. Homelessness can be the type of homelessness that we're talking about, whole family homelessness, the new type of homelessness, if you want to use that phrase, is here because of a lack of affordable and social housing. A lack of homes affordable to people to buy or rent on the scale that's necessary. Now, what way are we going to achieve such a scale? Is it by giving more incentives to the private rented sector to build? That clearly hasn't worked, although it's the main plank of the government. Is it by forcing more people into the private rented sector because you haven't built council homes? That hasn't worked either. And this isn't just a legacy issue, like your self-serving amendment argues. It's not just a legacy issue from previous regimes, as the amendment suggests. There's 140,000 more people in the private rented sector since you came to power in 2011, a phenomenal rise in precarious reliance on landlords. And neither is it because you're trying to catch up now with affordable and local authority home building, which we know hasn't been happening. This government has built less council houses than any government ever before it. So let's just nail this one on the head. I'll give you a couple of quick statistics. In 1975, 8,794 council houses were built. In 1985, 6,523 were built. In 2005 even, 4,209 were built. But what's the situation in 2015? 20 council houses were built in the first half of this year. An embarrassing figure which the government has now tried to cover over by suddenly saying that that will increase tenfold by the end of the year. So, whoopee, we'll have 200 council houses by the end of the year. When you compare them with the figures that I've given you, it's just incredible that you would argue that you're doing more than any government did before. Even your forerunners during the Troika imposition. In 2008, there was 4,905 council houses built, and even in 2010, there was 1,328 built. So, you know, to argue that you're doing more is really an insult. And, you know, the emperor will soon be discovered to be naked because people will see these houses simply aren't here. Not only are you not building council housing, but you've reduced the obligation on developers under the Part 5 scheme, despite a vociferous debate in this House, a shameful decision to make. Now, what needs to be done? In this motion, we argue this is an emergency. We need to take emergency measures. All economic evictions should be outlawed where a person does not have alternative accommodation. We need to stop the hemorrhage of homelessness. All repossessions should end as well, where it involves the vacating of a property by somebody who's renting it. We need to reverse the rent supplement cuts to keep people in their current homes. As I said, to stop any more people becoming homeless. And isn't it incredible that tonight there's a record number on the streets, in hotels, or in the misery of paying a huge amount of their income in rent, while we have the biggest construction operation, NAMA, in this country, with vast land banks, vast numbers of assets, offices, houses, etc., and cash reserves. It's not like they don't have any money. NAMA should be turned into an agency for social and affordable housing. Now, Alan Kelly told a blatant untruth today in an article in a newspaper. He said that NAMA was playing its part in solving homelessness, that it would provide starter and affordable homes for people. That's completely untrue. 90% of NAMA's homes will be sold on the open market at market rates, as is currently the case, so no different to any other type of housing estate. The Minister also argued that NAMA can't be forced to focus exclusively on providing much-needed social housing because it has a commercial mandate. But as Focus Ireland have said, exactly what we're arguing in this motion, the government has a majority and it can change NAMA's mandate at any time. Come into this stall with a proposal and change the constitution of NAMA. The government amendment also argues that NAMA has delivered 1,600 houses and apartments. That's derisory. It's pathetic over the years of its existence. How many does it have? The books need to be opened. We need to stop the sale now of NAMA's assets and use its cash reserves for the building of social and affordable housing. And finally, Ceann Comhairle, just to say that NAMA has in its hands $3 billion in cash for development. It also has an expected $4 billion from overseas sales. $7 billion could build potentially 70,000 houses over the next few years if land was acquired at, and just used using emergency measures. There's also billions, as we point to, in the Strategic Investment Fund.
Thanks, Deputy. And Deputy Murphy is next.
Thanks, Ciara. It's now almost a year since Jonathan Corry died, not very far from here. In the aftermath of his death, we were promised a lot of things. We were promised that things were going to change, that kind of thing wouldn't happen again. Slightly before his death, we were promised the largest housing programme probably in the history of the state. We've had promises, we've had plans, we've had announcements, we've had press releases, we've had press conferences. What we haven't had is the building of homes. And homeless people cannot live in promises. And it's why it's entirely appropriate for all the different housing groups, different political parties, including the Anti-Austerity Alliance, and different trade unions to come together on the 1st of December, the anniversary of Jonathan Corry's death, at 5 o'clock on Molesworth Street for a major national protest about this housing and homeless emergency that we have. Because the reality is that since then, the tsunami of homelessness has continued and has worsened, and we're now facing into a period of months, or a month, that will be a major, major crisis, where it'll be worse than ever before. Because on a monthly basis, the number of homeless families, the number of homeless children are increasing now at a rate of 82 families per month. And then in the course of December, there aren't going to be hotel places. Hotel places are booked up, aren't accepting homeless people. And so this tsunami is going to appear in parks, in streets, beside rivers, across this city in particular and across this country. The crisis that exists of homelessness that's affecting people is going to become very, very public and will shame the government. We're in danger of going down a situation like exists in many American cities, of tent cities, of people, homeless people, forced to live in tents for long periods of time. And that's going to happen if the government doesn't take emergency action. And the key demand in our motion is very, very simple. We're asking the Dáil and the government to recognise the fact that this is an emergency. It has to be called an emergency first of all, and then we have to take the appropriate emergency action to deal with it. Because we don't have that action whatsoever by the government. And in the government's amendment, they refer to the complexity of the situation. The solution is multifaceted, etc. This is not that complex. Obviously, in individual cases of individual people who are homeless, yes, there can be complicated things. But the overall national housing and homelessness emergency is not very complicated. What we need is very, very simple. It's clear. We need real rent controls, and we need a supply of social and affordable housing for people that they can afford, which will also lift the pressure in terms of rent. It's quite simple. And it's only those, like the government, which includes the Labour Party, which are completely blinded by Thatcherite dogma, that can't see the action that we need to take. And all of the action that the government proposes to take, it remains completely bound within the straitjacket of the EU fiscal rules, which are an embodiment of that Thatcherite dogma. It's about the privatisation of council homes, it's about the incentivisation of private developers to build, and it's about a sop about rent certainty that does nothing whatsoever. If we want a solution, the precondition is to say that the right of people to a home comes before the right of landlords to maximise their rental income, the right of banks to maximise their returns on mortgages, and the rights of developers and construction companies to maximise their profit. And I think a majority of people in this state would agree with that notion. The right to a home should come first. And then the consequences flow quite logically from that. Take the issue of rent controls, where we heard that Minister Kelly was going to fight the fight against Fine Gael and ensure that we had rent controls linked to the rate of inflation. That was the fight. He was going to stand up to the party of the landlords, and he was going to ensure that we got it. Instead, we have what is lauded in the government's amendment as rent certainty. The only certainty is that people are going to face massive rent increases on a 2-yearly basis instead of every year. It means that people don't have the worries of their rent increases every year, but instead have twice the worry every 2 years. We know that the rent increases in the course of the last 3 months has been the highest that they have ever been, and we know that the tenant associations, those that are dealing with tenants, overwhelmingly say that this is a joke. It is no real response to the crisis of absolutely spiralling rents that people simply cannot afford. The answer is very simple. It's put forward in our motion, is rent controls linked to the consumer price index, linked to inflation, and backdated to 2011, when rents were somewhat affordable for people. And then empowering the PRTB, democratising the PRTB, resourcing the PRTB, for then people to be able to go to the PRTB and say, I deserve a rent reduction based on 2011 plus inflation, my rent is too high. And actual rent controls, as exist, different forms of rent controls exist all around the world in many different forms. The other side of that is not pushing ahead with the privatisation of our banking system. Instead, having a public banking system working as a democratically controlled public utility in the interests of society rather than the interests of the profits of the banks, and as part of that, facilitating the write-down of mortgages, both of buy-to-let landlords and of those who live, owner-occupiers who live in their homes, to affordable levels. I want to speak briefly about the specific question of traveller accommodation, which is one of the real shames on this House, on this government, on councils across the country, particularly in the light of the Carrick Mines tragedy, because the funding for traveller accommodation was cut by 90% between 2008 and 2013. I mean, far, far more than any other aspect of government spending, and even then the councils didn't even apply for and take all of that funding that was available. That's partly because of the kind of disgusting, right-wing, racist, dog whistle politics pursued by some councillors in different local authorities, which is to treat traveller accommodation as something that is to be avoided as opposed to being built. That needs to be transformed now. It needs to be properly resourced from central government, and then we need the councils to access those funds and to build appropriate accommodation. I also want to talk about the question of appropriate accommodation for refugees and asylum seekers. Minister O'Riordan, quite eloquently, has described the situation of direct provision as inhumane and intolerable. That was well over a year ago that he said that. And yet it continues, this inhumane and intolerable situation. Over 4,000 people still in conditions that are, and I've visited a number of these centres, they are akin to open prisons where people have no sense of independence or anything else. They have to be removed, direct provision needs to end, they need to be given appropriate housing, and also any new refugees that are coming into this state need to be provided with decent homes, not putting into something akin to direct provision. That can be done. Refugees don't need to be pitted against homeless people or those in housing crises in this state now. The resources exist on a vast scale to provide decent homes for everybody, as is outlined in our motion. The resources exist to do all of this. It's a question of mobilising the resources, recognising an emergency to do it. It's a question of turning NAMA from a life support machine for the developers into a democratic body with a different mandate to provide social and affordable homes. It's about the funds that Deputy Coppinger referred to in terms of the development levies of NAMA, in terms of the overseas property that it controlled, and the Strategic Investment Fund. It's also about a progressive taxation system. It's about having a taxation system that taxes corporations for their profits, that taxes millionaires for their wealth, that taxes high earners for their high earnings, and that uses those resources to provide homes. One very short example to finish is the example of Apple. It is so shameful that the Irish government is going to line up beside Apple against the European Commission to say we don't want the taxes that are owed to the taxpayer. We don't want the up to 17 billion euros that we could use to build homes because we're more interested in Apple not paying any taxes. The resources exist. It's a question of political priority to say that homes, ending homelessness, ending the housing crisis comes before Apple not paying any tax.
Thanks, Deputy. I have 3 remaining speakers offering, I understand, Deputy Murphy, Deputy Pringle and Deputy Fleming. So roughly 6 minutes, minutes each.
The one thing that is very obvious from the very empty chamber tonight is that the government certainly are not seeing this as the emergency that some of the rest of us are seeing it as. I think if there are 2 basic needs that you would ask people what are the 2 most basic needs, they will say it's food and shelter. And for a sizable proportion of our population, the area of shelter is precarious, to say the least. I want to support the call for the declaration of a housing emergency, because that's what it is, and anyone that is meeting people and has been meeting people for the last few years would know that's what it is. The really outrageous thing is that it could be foreseen, and no matter what you do, the solution is going to cost money. But what we have done is, or what has happened has been, that there has been added stress and anxiety for families who can't believe that they're finding themselves in this position. You know, and the method of the resolution have opted for is straight out of the Thatcher playbook. You know, it's a market solution when there's no obvious there's no evidence that the market is going to deliver the solution. On numerous occasions over the past few years, when challenged on the adequacy of rent caps or rent supplement, the Taoiseach kept on saying it was a supply side issue, as though, you know, that was going to happen outside of a government response. Yet the supply of housing was diminishing on the other side, and ironically, something as vital as housing was the responsibility of a junior rather than a senior minister. Housing and communities require a designated minister, and perhaps the ideology of the market, which has clearly failed, is getting in the way of that. In 2013, it became apparent that there was a new category of people becoming homeless. In fact, we had homeless charities in at our committee in early 2013. And that category were functioning families. The reason was because their inability to pay rent, for no other reason. At the same time, the supply side that was referred to by the Taoiseach was going backwards. You know, and then we had the big announcement of the 3.7 billion to be spent on social housing. But when you drill that down, the majority will be delivered through the housing assistance payment. Again, the reliance on the market. The HAP scheme is wholly dependent on the private sector to build and lease housing. This will not be a once-off payment. It will reoccur each year and each decade. To be successful, there will have to be sufficient private sector supply and landlords who will opt for the HAP scheme. The scheme is currently being commenced in Kildare, and in the case of people at risk of becoming homeless, it's permitted that you can exceed the cap by 20%, but go and try and find a house for even with the additional 20%, and I've got to say, you'll surprise me if you even come back with one. Both the cap and the 20% it is permitted to be exceeded by are below market rents in the area. For the past year, it has been possible to negotiate with the rents unit to increase above what is proposed in these cases, and I can predict, unfortunately, that we're going to see a whole raft of new people becoming homeless in the new year. Nationally, 40% of those at work are earning less than €12 an hour. We have precarious employment circumstances with zero-hour and low-hour contracts. And unless that changes significantly, the prospect of people being in a position to buy houses is really diminished. So the solution will have to be to build houses, and to build houses in the kind of quantities that are required. Other than that, we're going to see this situation overwhelming us. And in fact, I think that's what the charities are saying at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy. And Deputy Pringle.
Thank you, Cahir. I'd like to fully support this motion tonight on the housing emergency. Since the government has come into office, there have been a series of crises in our society. A jobs crisis, a health crisis, and now the housing crisis. It's part of the wider social crisis emerging as a result of an austerity-led coalition obsessed with investing in the private sector for cheap jobs and not investing in its own citizens. On an individual level, housing problems are the sum total of a person's own issues, mitigated by the lack of protection afforded to them by authorities in a position to assist. On a government level, it's sheer failure to govern that leaves people to their own devices on the streets. They are becoming homes to too many people, too many families, and tragically to too many children. This is no longer a housing crisis, but a housing emergency that affects nearly every person in this country. Housing in Ireland is not meeting the needs of our society, and that says a lot about the cumulative effects of this coalition's policies. The government's response to all this has been hypocritical. It has refused to intervene in the market as they upheld their position as the guardians of neoliberalism, yet here we are now soon to face legislation which seeks to actually intervene in that market. And this idea, even this one, is a short-sighted one. It will intervene on a minimal level and will do nothing to relieve the housing crisis without a stream of packages to support it. The government presents an idea to freeze rents for 2 years. This short-sighted initiative has only seen landlords hiking up rents even further. Daft.ie's recent report has highlighted this fact starkly for everybody. The proposals will also give a €3,000 slap on the wrist for landlords deceiving tenants into leaving only to bring in higher paying tenants. And do we seriously think that this government will actually target landlords who do this? This is simply a cynical attempt to address the emergency with no sense of urgency attached to it. If that is the best that the government can do after months of a public spat between Minister Kelly and Noonan and a tug-of-war between the coalition partners, then how can the public have any faith in this government to deliver any solutions for the housing crisis? The government has also established a suspicious grouping within the Department of the Environment called the Social Housing Clearinghouse Group, to address the funding issue around the providing of social housing on a cross-departmental level, apparently. It was established to examine and consider proposals from companies, groups and institutions with a vested interest in this issue. If that doesn't sound dodgy enough, the group is a subgroup of the finance workstream as part of the governance structures of the social housing strategy up to 2020. It is chaired by a senior official from NAMA and comprises the Department of Environment, Finance, Public Expenditure and Reform, the Housing Agency, Dublin City Council and the National Economic and Social Council. After a call for submissions, 24 proposals were received since its establishment for funding social and affordable houses. These proposals have been presented by financial institutions, developers, fund managers, financial service providers, some approved housing bodies and others. Some of these bodies that presented to the department have names like the Dublin Artisan Dwelling Fund, but when you actually search to try and find out what the Dublin Artisan Dwelling Fund is, the only reference you can find to it on the internet is in relation to a housing programme that was done in the 1870s in this city, in Dublin. Another proposal presented to the department was a fund called Bartra Capital, which was only incorporated in August, and yet this year, but yet was invited to present to the Clearinghouse Group as if they have some great proposals on how to fund social housing. But yet we consider a proposal from the Irish League of Credit Unions